Good morning, everybody. Now, the Rwanda migrant scheme has just failed spectacularly and catastrophically, and that isn't any surprise. We hear that there were going to be over 100 people on the first deportation flight to Rwanda, and then there were about 37, then 11, then 8, and now there's none. This was never going to work. It was always set up to fail. I said that at the very beginning. It was announced on, I think, the 14th of April, at the beginning of this year's local election campaign, and its purpose was to provide some red meat to Tory voters or ex-Tory voters to try to bring them back into the fold and vote for the Johnson regime because they've been so absolutely awful on every single policy area you can imagine. And for 12 years, this fake Conservative Party has been in power in the UK, and they have presided over the biggest rise in mass, rapid, unsustainable, uncontrollable immigration that we've seen. They have even been worse than Tony Blair and Gordon Brown when they were in power. And that you wouldn't think that was possible, but they have. And under Blair and Brown, net immigration went up from around 30 or 40,000 a year before they came in to 150 to 200,000 a year when they left in 2010. But since 2020 to now, net immigration's gone up from about 150 to 200,000 a year to over 300,000 a year. And that's not including the people that we don't know about who are coming into the country quietly on the backs of lorries and so on. We only find out about this when something goes tragically wrong, like those 27 Vietnamese who were found dead in the back of a lorry in Tilbury a couple of years ago. But of course, we can see the illegal migrants coming across the channel in dinghies, because that's a relatively new thing. In 2019, there were just about 2,000. 2020, there were 8,000. In 2021, 28,000 coming across in dinghies. And already this year, there's been over 10,000. And we're on course for something like 60 to 100,000 coming across the channel on dinghies. And the fake Conservatives have not done anything about it whatsoever up until now. But of course, what's visible, what's seen, is getting out of hand. And so they're pretending to do something about it. They're not doing what they should do, which is towing the boats back to France so that they can't get into British waters in the first place. But what they're doing is creating this scheme that is set up to fail as a PR exercise. But of course, you've got human rights law and so on. They knew that this wasn't going to work. And, for all of the time they've been in power, they could have done something about human rights law to make it so that we do have our human rights, but the country has the right to deport people who are coming into the country illegally. But they've done nothing about that at all. So we have, at the end of this sorry saga, the European Court of Human Rights intervening to say that the government is not allowed to deport some of the individuals on the flight. But of course, that's all of the remaining 8 individuals on the flight, and human rights lawyers have put in cases on their behalf to the British courts, the European Court of Human Rights, and they've the British High Court ruled that the deportations could go ahead. The European Court of Human Rights said they can't. Now, this itself is very suspicious. So, look, I've always said the European Convention on Human Rights of 1950 was a very good convention because it was written by British lawyers for a continent that had been devastated by National Socialism in the Second World War. And nations had all of their legal, political, economic infrastructure had been devastated. So Britain, being the only free country left standing at the end of the Second World War, of course, freeing and liberating Western Europe from the Nazis, put in place the European Convention on Human Rights to ensure that the oppression that happened by the National Socialists could never happen again. But it doesn't work. Where was the European Court of Rights over the last 2 years when there were lockdowns? When governments all over Europe were breaking human rights law and oppressing the peoples of the nations of Europe and around the world as well with utter tyranny for 2 years. I didn't hear a single thing from the European Court of Human Rights. I didn't hear a single judgment to say you can't put people in prison and fine them and close down their businesses just simply for doing normal things like meeting your friends or going to church or opening your businesses. Where were they then to ensure that we had our human rights? And normally, a case will take years before it gets to the European Court of Human Rights. First, it would have to go through the High Court and then the Appeal Court and then the Supreme Court, and then it will get to the European Court, either the ECJ or the ECHR. But this seems to have gone through, been submitted, and then they've given a judgment in a matter of days when it normally takes years. So, of course, this is just one of the another example of institutional capture by lefty liberals who want to impose all of their agendas on nations and peoples undemocratically by circumventing democracy. And the European Court of Human Rights has obviously been subjected to the same long march through the institutions as the universities, as the BBC and media institutions, and the political parties, the major political parties in most of the countries in the world, and local governments and so on. So it isn't surprising, after 72 years after a good convention was put in place, you've now got people, a whole new generation has come up of people who weren't even alive in 1950 who are implementing sort of agendas, left-wing agendas, and so on. And they want open borders, and they want to support mass rapid immigration. And they will not do anything to stop that. In fact, they will actively use their power and position to obviously stop the flight going to Rwanda, as we've seen. However, inadvertently, they've done us a favour. They don't realise it, but they have. The human rights lawyers, the European Court of Justice, have actually done this country a favour. Because what I never hear in any discussion of the Rwanda deal is a discussion or a quotation of what's actually in the Rwanda migrant scheme. So on April the 14th, the government published a memorandum of understanding between the governments of the United Kingdom and the government of the Republic of Rwanda. Concerning the provision of an asylum partnership agreement. And you go down quite a long way. The first 15 sections are all about transfer of migrants from the UK to Rwanda, how much we're going to pay, their rights, and so on, what will happen, the deal, everything concerning them. Then you get to section 16, which is entitled Resettlement of Vulnerable Refugees. It says this: the participants will make arrangements for the United Kingdom to resettle a portion of Rwanda's most vulnerable refugees in the United Kingdom. So this is not a one-way scheme where the UK is paying Rwanda to take some illegal migrants from the UK to Rwanda, and that's it. It's a two-way scheme. It's an exchange scheme. So if an aeroplane took off with migrants going to Rwanda, it would come back with migrants coming from Rwanda to the UK. And those would be the most vulnerable migrants, probably from places like Congo, where there is a terrible war going on, and a lot of people are coming out of Congo, and they're seeking safety and shelter in Rwanda. But we would send migrants to Rwanda. Rwanda would send migrants back to the UK. So the number of people, actually net number of people transferring in this scheme would be zero, I imagine. Or maybe even we would take more, because the number is not actually specified. It doesn't specify this is a one-for-one deal. It just says the UK will resettle some migrants from Rwanda in the UK. Now, I imagine that would mean every time there's a flight goes to Rwanda, they'd fill it up with people who would come from the Congo, who are migrants in Rwanda, to come to the UK. So the flight would go over, whether it had 100 people on it or 10 people on it or 1 people on it, and they just fill up the aeroplane and send it back, and that would not be reported on by the mainstream media. There wouldn't be anyone there with cameras to look at the flight as it landed, wherever it landed, and to see who comes off the flight from Congo via Rwanda to the UK. But that is what this deal said, and that's hardly ever mentioned anywhere in the mainstream media. So inadvertently, these human rights lawyers have actually done us a favor, because they've stopped migrants coming from Rwanda to the UK, as well as stopping migrants going from the UK to Rwanda. So I'm not going to get up in arms about this like a lot of so-called conservative commentators I hear today are saying, oh, this is terrible. Isn't Boris wonderful? Isn't Priti Patel wonderful for trying to do this scheme in the first place? And the ECHR has stopped us from deporting migrants. Yes, they have. But they've also stopped migrants from coming from Rwanda to the UK inadvertently. And I'm not going to praise Boris Johnson and Priti Patel, because this is only a little bit of a sticking plaster over the mess that they've made and their party has made over the last 12 years, when they could have done something a long, long time ago to make sure that we never got into the situation we are now. I'm not going to praise them for doing a tiny little bit to clear up their own mess. And if you're a conservative commentator, really, you stop puffing Boris and Priti Patel. They're not on our side. They're not doing anything really to stop the mass immigration. There's still over 100 coming across the channel every day. And that's the ones we can see. You're not even looking at the ones who are coming in legally, with all of the extra schemes that they've made for graduate visas and seasonal visas and employment visas for new areas. It's just got out of control. So, yes, I'm not in favour of us staying in the European Convention of Human Rights, simply because it doesn't work. It's a good convention, but it doesn't work, and it hasn't worked for us when we've really needed it to prevent our government from implementing tyranny over the last 2 years. Is it going to work if they decide to go back and implement more tyranny? I very much doubt it. But of course, yeah, they will. The lefty lawyers who have taken it over will taken the court over. Of course, they will do everything they can to keep on allowing mass immigration to take place. But stop puffing Boris and Priti Patel, please, please. Use your loaf, everybody. My goodness. Anyway, there we go. So I may have a different take on this to a lot of the pundits, both on the left and on the right. But I'm just looking at this from all the angles. And the Rwanda scheme was just a PR scheme. It was set up to fail. So don't be too worried about this not working. What we need to do is get people in the border force who actually want to protect our borders. And that's another issue, because it seems the union of the border force workers actually was involved in bringing the court cases that got this stopped, got the flight stopped. Why? If you're in the border force, you should want to control our borders and stop people coming in illegally. You shouldn't be wanting to bring people to Dover like a taxi service, but that seems to be what's happening. So what we need is actually to properly sort out the border force and get rid of all the people who are in the border force who don't actually want to control our borders, because that seems like it's an institution also that's been captured, as has a lot of the civil service in the country. Or we need a whole new agency to circumvent the border force, staffed by people who actually will control our borders like the Poles do. Why don't we get some of our Polish people to be in the border force? I'm sure they'd do a better job than all the lefties that are in it at the moment.